What if I told you that before the Ramones, before the Sex Pistols, before the Clash, before the Damned, there was a little band in Australia making punk music as early as 1973? This is the story of the Saints. I actually didn't know much about the Saints before I started researching this video. I didn't know much about Australian punk music at all. Someone commented on one of my videos and suggested that I look into it, and it sounded really fascinating. So this video is the result of that, but I will warn you that it primarily looks at the early days of the Saints. It looks at kind of that first iteration before Ed leaves the band. So can I help you? So I know a lot of people might only know the Saints for their later work when Chris was kind of leading the band, but the early days was what I was most interested in, so I tend to focus on that in this video, so sorry about that, figured I'd let you know up front. If you end up enjoying this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe if you want to come along on my journey where I'm trying to learn as much as I can about music history. That's the point of this channel, just have a little bit of fun and learn some music history. So subscribe if that sounds interesting to you. It's free to do. You can always unsubscribe or don't, but I hope you enjoy the video anyway. Chris Bailey had a pretty interesting early life. He was born in Kenya in either late 1956 or early 1957. I saw both dates, so I'm not really sure which one is accurate. And then his family moved around a ton, including a stay in his parents' native Northern Ireland. His dad was in the military, so that's just kind of what happens when you're a military family. You move around a lot. But Ireland wasn't exactly the safest place to be at that time with all of the political unrest. So his father, Robert, heard that Australia was taking in immigrants, and he found a job as a night watchman and moved to Brisbane when Chris was around 10 years old. Chris had a brother and 4 sisters, so it was a whole troop of them that was moving around all this time. Chris explained his kind of accidental first foray into music, saying, quote, "My first instrument was the bagpipes, which was an ethnic thing, not very sexy or rock and roll. At high school, I met a couple of blokes with similar interests. One night, there was a party at a church hall with a band playing. We must have been a bit pissed, so we raided the stage and played the instruments. Accidentally, I discovered a flair for singing, and it turned into a way of life." He met Ed Cooper during high school detention when they were both about 14 and quickly became great friends. According to Ed, they bonded over being outsiders and the shared feeling of kind of like being outcast in their culture, which wasn't that hard to be since Brisbane at that time was very uniform and very conservative in a lot of ways. One documentary I watched described Brisbane at that time as being a crucible of blandness, and the authorities were ready to crack down on particularly young people who wanted to express themselves in different and maybe kind of chaotic ways, and especially young people who wanted to protest the right-leaning government. The really conservative leader of Queensland was cracking down on protesters, so it was all around a really strange time, and as a current American, I can't relate to that at all. Chris Bailey said about it, "It was like I grew up in a 1950s American B-grade black and white movie." Ed Cooper was born in what was then West Germany in 1955, and they also immigrated to Brisbane in the 60s. Ed's love of music started around the age of 9 when his parents bought him his first guitar, something that he still owns and loves. It's the guitar that he wrote several of the early songs on, like I'm Stranded. And then speaking of writing songs, he started writing songs really early, like even before playing the guitar. His parents told him a story about the first song he ever wrote when he was like 4 or 5 years old. He said, "I wrote a song about a green steam engine that turned into a rocket ship. That was written in my sandbox. That was my earliest song. After that, the subject matters became a little less interesting, less freeform for a little while when I thought I had to write proper songs." Some of the first albums that he bought and loved were actually live albums, like The Who's famous Live at Leeds. So that energy of a live show must have had some impact on his early sound, and he said he never really even thought about doing anything else but music. That's the only thing that made sense for him to do. Ed and Chris were really into the American blues scene because there was apparently a great record store near where they lived that focused heavily on blues music, so they would pick up a lot of those records. But then they heard Iggy and the Stooges, and that transformed everything for them. Soon they were also listening to groups like the New York Dolls and MC5, and basically everyone that the other founding punk bands were listening to. They started playing a little music together and just bouncing around the idea of starting a band when they happened to pass Ivor Hayes on the street. Ivor remembered it was a Friday or Saturday night, and I was going off to the cinema, and there was Ed and Chris, and they were going off to a party. They asked if I wanted to come. We're 15 or 16, and we managed to get a bottle of something. We drank and we ended up talking and singing, and that's how we ended up doing things together. Ivor Hay, as far as I can tell, was actually born in Brisbane, unlike the other two, and he said that he came from a large family and his father died when he was pretty young. He started his love of music by playing piano before switching to bass, and after some band lineup changes, he landed on playing drums. According to Ivor, Ed taught him how to play guitar, and then Ivor taught Chris, so the three of them were always incredibly linked by their past history with music. Ivor talked about the bond that the three of them had, saying, "We kind of understood each other and appreciated each other's humor and style and all the other things, and music just seemed to be a really natural progression. It just seemed to happen organically." But something that made the three of them special when they played music together was that they were building something completely unique. No one else in Brisbane was really trying to do what they were doing. They wanted to bottle that aggression of early rock and roll and that kind of chaotic energy and feeling associated with the music, and no one else was doing that around them. Ed said that he always knew exactly what he wanted the band to sound like, and because the three of them clicked so well, it really helped them build that musical sound. Yes, Ajax, how can I help you? In 1973, they officially started their band, calling it Kid Galahad and the Eternals, which was taken from an Elvis Presley movie, because they had this kind of like aggressive and wild and chaotic sound that could sometimes break out into fights in the crowd. They weren't allowed to play in a lot of the more prominent and kind of established Brisbane rock clubs. So Kid Galahad ended up breaking up, but they would reform after a few months with a new name and a new identity. Ed liked reading and collecting old paperback novels, so they took the name of a Leslie Chatteris character and renamed themselves the Saints. Along with the name change, they also had some lineup changes. Jeffrey Wegener joined as a drummer, but he'd leave pretty quickly after that. When he left, Ivor officially switched to drums and Kim Bradshaw joined on bass. I heard a story that Kim was told by a tea leaf reader that he would have fame and fortune by playing a 4-string instrument, which the fortune teller assumed meant a cello, but since Kim liked rock and roll, he picked up a bass and never looked back. Kim said that he saw the Saints or Kid Galahad playing at the Queensland Academy of Music, and he thought they were amazing. So when they said they were looking for a bass player, he jumped at the opportunity. In Australia, the Saints were carving out a little niche against all the odds because they sounded so different to everything else. As Ivor explained, Brisbane was still lapping up the disco scene. The clubs were full of glittering sequins. We would play gigs in Petrie Terrace to about 20 or 30 people. Their audience wasn't big, but it was passionate. They understood the revolutionary sound that these guys were trying to do. They understood the aggression that the band wanted to bottle. But concert promoters did not, and I heard that at this time, pretty much all of the rock booking went through one person in Brisbane who loved more of that psychedelic slow jam band type rock, which was not the Saints, so they had a really hard time getting booked anywhere. According to Kim, that one guy who booked all of the rock shows, quote, he wanted bands who only played covers like Smoke on the Water, and the Saints were never going to do that. Ed said in that same article that people who had heard about the Saints and heard about this rock band but had never actually heard their music would try and book them for like out of town shows, and that led to some pretty strange lineups. He said, "We did some ridiculous shows in Sydney. We played with the Ritchie family, who were an American disco group. Who came up with that idea?" The idea for their band from the very beginning was to follow in the footsteps of bands like the Stooges and MC5, the more stripped back rock and roll. They also pointed out that the political nature of MC5 was energizing for them because of the climate of Brisbane at the time with a very conservative, is it president or prime minister of Queensland? I forgot the correct term. I'm sorry. I have a whole video about the MC5, so if you want to learn more about that band, I'll link it in the description below, but very interesting story there as well. So putting that kind of sound with like a disco band was never going to work, but Ed also said that he never tried to sound like any of his influences. Sure, he loved the Stooges, he loved MC5, he loved American blues, but it wasn't like he was going to set out to try and make the same music the Stooges were making. He just took in that influence and thought, okay, I'm going to build what I want to build out of it. I'm going to take what I enjoy and have that influence what I put out instead of just trying to be like them. So he never tried to sound like anyone. They were never trying to fit into a genre. They just wanted to play what they wanted to play, which I think is the essence of punk music. Ed thought the idea of them being different than any other band meant that more people would want to come and see them, since it's kind of like this oddity. It didn't really work out that way, but they did build their little loyal following. There were also police raids and fights to deal with, so the Saints got a little annoyed with all of that, and they took the house that they were rehearsing in and turned it into their own venue called Club 76. Ed said that it seemed far easier to bring people to them instead of trying to go out and find the people. He said, I think we quickly developed a reputation as being the worst band that had ever existed, and then other people thought we were the best thing that had ever come along. But now they had a new hurdle. No one in Brisbane was prepared to help them out and partner with them to get their music out there, so they knew they needed to do it on their own somehow. In June of 1976, they booked their own studio time and recorded their first single, I'm Stranded, pressing just 500 copies. No label wanted to sign them, so they just started their own label in order to release it. It hit the Australian music scene with a resounding thud. No one particularly cared about it. I say that a bit tongue-in-cheek, of course. Some people cared. It even got a bit of radio airplay, and their little scene that they were building really loved it, but in terms of the Australian pop music press, no one paid much attention to it. No one reviewed it favorably. No one cared about it. But they had the foresight to send a few copies over to England, where the music scene was entirely different than it was in Australia. And the English scene loved it. Ed talked about how everything was built step by step. They had no idea what they were doing. They were just trying to figure it out as they went along. And he talked about when they sent that single out, getting the first review back from the Australian press, and it just wrote them off. It didn't take them seriously. So then when they started getting calls from England, how incredible that felt and how he felt very validated in what he was trying to do. EMI, the British record label, then called their Australian branch and demanded that the Australian branch sign the Saints to a 3-record deal, something that the guy over the Australian branch wasn't really interested in doing, but he did it because that's what you do when the boss tells you to do something. So the Saints are now signed to EMI on a 3-record deal. EMI had them record their first album, released in February of 1977, called I'm Stranded. It took them about 2 days to record the debut album, and Ed said it was mostly just their live set put on tape. Apparently, the songs they recorded initially were supposed to be demos. Ivor remembered, EMI here was really not keen on signing the band. It was all instigated from EMI's London office. But EMI had their way of working, and what you did was basically demo some songs, and that's what we did. But when we finished, we just said to Rod Coe, who was the producer, that's the album. And he said, okay. And no one in the Australian EMI were willing to push back on it much at all. They were like, let's just get this over with, essentially was their attitude. They ended up moving to Sydney for a little bit, but by May of 1977, it made sense for them to go to England. For one thing, they were way more respected over in England as being part of this emerging, exciting punk music, though Ed always stressed that he didn't see them as a punk band. He didn't see them as really any kind of band. They were just making their own music, but it fit in really well with what was happening in England. So they thought, we'll go over there, we'll tour a little bit, maybe we'll record our second album. It was never supposed to be like a permanent thing. Ed remembered it was just planned to be a couple of months to tour and maybe do some recording, but it was really enjoyable and it was really promising. And so we decided there was absolutely no reason for us to move back to Australia. Immediately, they started to get into conflict with EMI about branding and image. EMI wanted to capitalize on the punk wave and market them as a typical punk band, but the Saints weren't interested in that. Chris had long hair, which didn't fit the punk image. Think Sid Vicious, think Johnny Rotten, think Joe Strummer with the kind of short cropped hair. The Saints wore normal clothes and just didn't look like punks, which was fine with them, but it confused the industry. Through the years, the Saints have had different perspectives on punk, with Chris saying, I saw punk as a marketing gimmick. Even as a teenager, I didn't like the notion of being sold to a demographic. He said elsewhere about punk, it had become a marketing tool by 1977. I heard Jilted John and I thought that was actually quite funny, but it reminded me of how the English punk scene quickly became a 2 pints of lager, Benny Hill comedy music. They weren't really interested in putting themselves into a niche. They wanted to do their own thing, and they were finding success regardless of their image. Their single, This Perfect Day, reached number 34 on the charts and got them on top of the pops. They were seen as both pioneers of punk and a great representation of it. They were getting praise from people like the Ramones and the Damned, who said that they were one of the best punk bands going at that point. But in June, Kim Bradshaw decided to leave the band. I can't really figure out why, so if you know, please leave a comment and let me know. But he went on to play in a band called The Lurkers, and he was replaced by a British bassist named Algie Ward. Algie's first appearance with the band was on the single that hit number 34, so not a bad introduction. Their second album, Eternally Yours, released in 1978, and saw them expand and, I think, improve on their sound. Eternally Yours is probably probably my favorite album that they put out in this initial run. The arrangements and production on that album are much better in my opinion. Ed and Chris produced it, and at least according to Ed, it was a better record than their first, since the first was just demos and was just their live set. The second saw them experiment with the studio a little bit more and how that can change and enhance their sound, which they didn't do in their 2 days recording the first album. Chris said that the style of the first two albums was actually pretty similar. The difference was that they learned how much they loved being in the studio. After the second album, tension started to grow within the group, particularly between Ed and Chris. Ed said, "I wanted to push things musically in a way he didn't see eye to eye with. He was starting to write more himself. I had always rejected his songs. I feel bad about that these days, but they weren't representative of what we were doing." Chris actually left the band for a bit during this period. His girlfriend convinced him to move up north and open up a pub, but it became apparent pretty quickly that he was not the pub running type of guy. He wanted to be in the industry. He wanted to be making music, so he went back to London and rejoined the band. He also suspected that EMI would never have let the Saints record their third album if he had left the band, so kind of worked out all around. But even with this budding tension, Chris and Ed both agreed on one thing. They had no interest in trying to fit in commercially. They wanted to make their music and not worry about a scene or an industry, which wasn't EMI's favorite thing, but they knew no other way. Chris said, "It also occurred to me as a young man that trends come and go rather quickly. And I think if you're lucky enough to find the core of what you do, well, then it's a lot of fun refining that." But then after their third album came out, everything fell apart. Some people will do anything, well, that's what they say. They released Prehistoric Sounds later in 1978, and they leaned much heavier into the jazz and R&B sounds that they toyed with on Eternally Yours. It was more of a departure from the typical punk sounds, and it was a commercial failure, which caused EMI to drop them. After that, Ed had enough and he quit the band. It looked, at least from the outside, that the relationship between Ed and Chris had completely broken down. Ed once remarked that everything was a struggle with Chris and it was difficult to get anything done. Plus, their sounds were just wildly diverging at this point. Ed went back to Australia and started a band called Laughing Clowns that was far more post-punk and avant-garde. After the breakup, Ivor also returned to Australia and worked for a bit with a band called The Hitmen, but then he went back to England when Chris called and said that he wanted to reform the Saints. They went back to Australia to ask Ed if he was interested in restarting the group, and Ed said, quote, "He already had a band together, but he asked me if I wanted to be involved, and I said no. I also indicated I didn't think it was a great idea to go out as the Saints, but anyway, that happened. I'm not a litigious sort of person, and I expressed my disapproval, but I didn't do anything more about it." To be honest, I'm not as interested in this iteration of the Saints. It just doesn't align with my typical music history interest. I know a lot of people probably only know the Saints from this like 80s and 90s version. They were much more prolific during this point, and they kind of expanded their name and their sound. So some people might be watching this video and only know them for that and have no idea about these first three albums. But I wanted to talk about primarily the first three albums in this video. Chris kept the band going throughout the years with several different lineups. There are so many members of the Saints. Ivor played in most of those lineups. Ed did reunite with them, but it never became a long-lasting thing. He always said that Chris never wanted the original lineup to reunite, and Chris always believed that Ed just wanted the Saints to be lost to the mist of time, which of course Chris resented because he was still doing the Saints, so he didn't want them to just fade away. The Saints' last album was released in 2012. In 2022, Chris's wife confirmed his death of natural causes at the age of 65. He had been living in the Netherlands at the time, where he'd been living pretty quietly for the past few years. Meanwhile, Ed has continued a long string of solo work and other projects, including a band called The Aints, which I think is kind of funny. He's currently on tour with a group called the Saints 73 to 78, with Ivar kind of playing a lot of that early music with Mark Arm from Mudhoney on vocals, which is pretty cool. So it's a pretty short tour, not a lot of dates, but if they stop by near where you are, you should definitely go check that out. That's the story of the Saints, a scrappy little Australian punk band who paved their own way and were pioneers of this sound. I also think it's worth noting, meant to say it earlier in the video, I didn't. It's what happens when I forget to write it in my script. They take a lot of credit, and they deserve a lot of credit for being the foundational Australian punk band. And like I said, in a lot of ways that's deserved, but I want to stress that they weren't the only ones doing this at this point. There were also groups like Radio Birdman and a couple other people who were doing a similar sort of thing in taking the influence of the Stooges and MC5 and New York Dolls and creating this Australian punk scene. It wasn't just the Saints. And YouTube videos are hyperbolic. It can come across that way in this video, but that wasn't necessarily the case. And I think a Radio Birdman video would be super interesting. So might do that later. Subscribe if you want to see that. That's the story of the Saints. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you're a fan of them, if you know anything about them, or if, like me, you'd kind of overlooked them a little bit, unfortunately. Like the video if you ended up liking it, and subscribe so you don't miss out on more stories from music history.